Gun violence is on the rise nationwide, but it's significantly worse for people of color. Communities of color are facing a constant struggle when it comes to shooting violence and deaths in our nation. Jamil Donath looks at the challenges these communities are facing and why.
Tardrick Fowler's love for his son is self-evident. It's on posters, T-shirts, and this truck he painted blue, his son's favorite color.
I really miss that smile of my son. You know, he just light up the world. When I see him smile, he makes me smile.
Charlie Fowler died from a gunshot wound on June 8, 2020, 4 days after he turned 19. He was supposed to be a walk-on for UT Austin's football team that year.
A lot of people in my family, you know, don't graduate, and he was so excited.
Austin police ruled it a suicide, but Fowler says the evidence says otherwise. He's been fighting to find the truth ever since.
I have to fight so hard to try to bring awareness to my community.
But this fight is not for his son alone.
I done buried so many people from gun violence, it breaks my heart.
Communities of color are disproportionately impacted by gun violence. Texas Department of Public Safety data shows the majority of homicide victims are Black and Hispanic. Criminal justice experts like Dr. Howard Henderson say this is because of socioeconomic disparities.
The most common denominator among violent offenders is poverty.
Dr. Henderson is the Center for Justice Research Director at Texas Southern University. The center's research found factors such as air pollution, insufficient food resources, housing insecurity, even population density were all predictive of violent behavior.
It's not the racial factor that's most impactful, but it's the socioeconomic reality that many of these individuals exist in within these communities.
Fowler says survivors of gun violence like him are also struggling with trauma.
It's like a bigger pandemic because the African Americans around here is suffering from gun violence.
Now his latest project is creating a tech hub for kids in his neighborhood. He says this tragedy is helping him turn his life around and help others do the same. Other cities in Texas are also trying to follow in Austin's footsteps and decriminalize weed, like here in San Marcos. Statewide, weed arrests are declining, but for Black and brown Texans, they're going up. To Joe Negrete, this is his rehab.
Horseshoe prints and barbed wire fences.
He works at a ranch, repairing fences and helping out around the property.
Just twisting the wire or something about it. I don't know. I get a satisfaction out of twisting it and making it pretty.
He got this job a few weeks ago, but he says with his record, it's not always easy finding work.
You get treated like you're a criminal, and it's just a little bit of weed.
Negrete was arrested for possession of marijuana twice last year.
And it was really, really stressful for me that time, and I did lose a lot.
State data shows in Texas, possession of marijuana arrests have been declining for more than a decade. But the percentages of those arrests that were Black Texans went from 26% to 34%. Sam Benavides and her co-workers at Mano Amiga started a petition to decriminalize marijuana in San Marcos. They're in the final weeks of collecting signatures.
This, up to date, is the biggest ballot initiative this town has seen.
Through her work, Benavides says she sees the impacts these laws have on Black and brown Texans.
We just want to end all legal penalties because just having a charge on your record, even if you're not arrested, can have so many consequences.
Center for Justice Research Director Dr. Howard Henderson is a criminologist at Texas Southern University and studies inequities in the justice system.
The issue really boils down to enforcement.
He says the center has found even in cities where marijuana is decriminalized, racial disparities remain.
Look, the war on drugs targeted Black and brown people, and that approach did not make our society safer.
Since Negrete served time, he stopped smoking marijuana. He still wants to see it legalized or decriminalized, so people like him don't have to go through the same thing. For Michael Lee Jr., barbecue runs in his blood.
Oh my goodness.
And so does East Austin.
I wish it would stay together, but it's just too tender.
Lee's dad was a pitmaster with dreams of owning his own shop. When that didn't happen, he promised to fulfill his dad's dream.
So my father's the reason why I did all this.
This barbecue food truck is one of 5 ventures Lee owns and operates.
In this neighborhood, we call it, you're a real hustler.
Being a black business owner comes with added obstacles, but even more so in a gentrified neighborhood.
Because the businesses weren't built for people such as myself to work their way up.
While historically black due to segregation and redlining, East Austin is becoming whiter and more affluent as higher prices push locals out.
Hello, how are you?
That means customers are changing too, making it harder for black businesses to survive in their own communities.
It's been terrible and it's been devastating watching, some of these historic establishments, restaurants, bar, clubs, to where everyone is just wiped out.
UT Austin Community Regional Planning Program Associate Professor Jake Wegman was one of 3 authors of the Austin Uprooted Report, which studies gentrification and solutions to combat it.
Unfortunately, I think if we continue on the trajectory we're on now, Central Austin is going to become a pretty exclusive jewel box.
The study found that housing shortages and land use laws in Texas make it harder to build affordable housing to keep up with the growing demand.
It's a lot harder than it needs to be to build new housing.
Wegman says we can't stop gentrification from happening, but the goal is to halt future displacement. As for Lee, he says he's staying put.
I'm never going anywhere. I'm going to thrive and flourish in this environment.
Well, May is Texas's rainiest month, and while we're going through a drought right now, climatologists say that can actually make flooding worse. According to the Texas Department of Insurance, only 14% of homeowners have flood insurance. Our Jamil Donna shows us how this is affecting communities.
On Francis Acuña Street, when it rains, it pours.
It feels like God just threw a bucket of water on us.
Catastrophic flooding like this happens every few years here. That's above average, and it's becoming even more frequent.
Still, you can see the line where the water was.
Acuña lives on Brassywood Drive in the Dove Springs community of South Austin.
They got flooded.
The neighborhood is more prone to localized flooding from aging infrastructure, lack of drainage, and surrounding development.
The water has nowhere to run but to the neighborhood.
You can still see the damage the flooding did to Acuña's house.
It broke like all this.
She can't afford flood insurance and doesn't have the money to fix it.
We work check by check. We don't have that extra money.
Because this is localized flooding and it's not in a high-risk flood zone, Acuña doesn't qualify for federal disaster funding or flood insurance assistance.
We didn't know how much damage it had caused.
The city of Austin is working on a flood risk reduction project in Brassywood. In 2020, the city began a 5-year effort to update floodplain models and maps. City of Austin floodplain administrator Kevin Shunk says there are more than 7,000 properties in Austin that are at risk of flooding.
We do have local flooding that occurs because the infrastructure does not have the capacity to convey floodwaters.
But this is also a statewide issue. Texas Water Development Board Flood Science and Community Assistance Director Saul Nucitelli says Texas has one of the highest flood fatalities in the country.
Flooding doesn't respect political boundaries, right? Water's going to go where it needs to go.
Right now, TWBD is remapping Texas's flood risk areas to include communities like Acuña's that experience localized flooding.
So we're going to cover the whole state, map every place, even rural places like parks and whatever. We're going to show the flood risk everywhere.
Acuña is actively working with several agencies to help communities like her.
They're still doing the same thing.
Who she says for too long have been fighting to stay afloat.
And came early to help me get that stuff.
Keisha Prince's apartment looks like she just moved in. She just moved back after being temporarily displaced because of storm damages.
This closet actually had visible mold. These places are hopelessly infected with mold.
Prince lives at a low-income apartment complex. It's in the Parker Lane East neighborhood in Austin, and it's smack dab in the middle of several future transportation projects, which puts her in an active displacement zone.
Every apartment complex that they put up here that's new is unaffordable.
These transportation lines are to make the city more accessible to communities like Princess. But anytime something moves in, someone ends up moving out. And that's what the City of Austin's newly created Displacement Prevention Office is trying to avoid.
Transit-induced displacements.
Nefertiti Jackman is a Community Displacement Prevention Officer with the Housing and Planning Department's new division.
It is to address the current needs of people, existing residents who are in their homes facing these displacement pressures.
Project Connect is a partnership with Cap Metro to allocate $300 million of a $7.1 billion transit investment to anti-displacement efforts.
These dollars are meant to address those challenges and those pressures now.
The project is now in its initial application process to distribute part of the funding to community organizations and nonprofits. Project Connect's anti-displacement maps show 302,000 people are at risk of displacement. 38% are in an active displacement zone. A majority are communities of color and low-income families, and more than half are renters.
Any help I could get, I would definitely sign up for it.
Prince already plans on moving out, and she says many people in her neighborhood already have. So even though construction on these transit lines haven't started yet, displacement is happening now, and the hope is to stop it in its tracks.